Welcome to my précis of what it looked like for nginx to move from mailing lists to pull requests. So why do this? Why present this? It's a discussion that comes up quite often around the Postgres community. Is the pull request model right for some of what we do? Maybe in addition to the current stuff with the mailing lists and the hand-polished patches, maybe instead of. It would be interesting to get some information about what's happened elsewhere. The question I'm particularly interested in around the experience from other projects is whether they gained anything. We can talk a lot about the frictions, etc., but very particularly what did they gain? And there's a recent example that we can look at, which is the nginx project. There's sort of 7-8 months of data from them. They made the move in September last year and turned off their historical infrastructure at the end of December. So in terms of a pure run, we've got sort of 5-ish months to look at. This is one of the areas of open source I'm particularly interested in, how projects can work together and learn from each other around some of the interfaces between Postgres and other stuff, be it languages like PHP. Spent a while teaching Drupal to speak Postgres better. And then a few other open source projects like RabbitMQ and Valkey. My name's Alistair. I'm a technical evangelist at Pacona, so DevRel guy, effectively. I used to be a pre-sales techie, so I'm still trying to get out of some of those habits. Been doing database things since the 90s. Went through all of that fun with the massive explosion in variety of open source databases at the end of the 90s, and settled on Postgres a few years later. So, what we're going to go through over the next sort of 20-ish minutes. We've spoken about why I think this is interesting, who I am. Just a little bit of background on the nginx project. I'm sure we've all used it at some point, but just give it a look. Then look at some of the raw numbers. This is quite a different project to Postgres. We'll talk about some of that. And then how it feels like the realities of Git, and particularly of GitHub, shaped the way the nginx community began behaving. I don't know if there is a name for that law, the computer says this way law, but yeah, have a look at what that was for nginx and Git, and then just some summary thoughts and some Q&A. I think it would be good to leave the Q&A to the end. This is a topic that we could really go down rabbit holes on and mess the timing up if it's all in the middle of things. So, what is nginx? It's a web server and reverse proxy, permissively licensed, 2-clause BSD, so they're in a similar sort of position openness-wise to us. The thing that made it popular, made it a big deal, is that it's an event loop rather than the pre-fork model that we use or that Apache HTTPD used. The big difference, though, is that this is not a standalone project. It is the open core of a commercial offering, which currently belongs to F5 Networks. So nginx open source used to host their own mercurial. I think some of what we see in the friction that they experienced moving to GitHub was that they were adopting a whole new set of tooling as well. Whereas for an organization like Postgres, where it is already using Git, some of those frictions would be less, some of the familiarity with the tooling is already there. And up until September, the only way you could get patches into nginx was via mailing list. Very similar situation to Postgres. And in September, they adopted all things GitHub. So they shut down the forums they managed themselves, moved that onto GitHub discussions. They shut down their bug tracker, moved that onto GitHub issues, and they started doing all their change work through PRs. So a very big change, and again, something far bigger than I've ever heard anyone suggest doing for Postgres, which has really only been around that pull requests bit. So by the numbers on the right there, for Postgres, a lot of them come from Robert Haas's State of Year in Postgres report. Obviously, the first thing that we can't know about any of these products is how much of it's out there, how many of them are installed. Lines of code-wise, Postgres is roughly 10 times the size of nginx, but less documentation intensive. The docs are only about double the size. If we look at how active the churn in the code base is, nginx was sort of moving around 50, 60 changes a month before they moved off the mailing lists, as against 1.5K-ish for Postgres. It is a code base with a lot less churn because there's a lot less opportunity to optimize things. It's a product that has quite a defined behavior, defined by public standards. Participants there, fair number, maybe not as many as you'd expect for a product that's so widely used. And then the thing that we're really looking at today around whether anything changed for them, how many people said, here's some code, and then how much of that actually made its way into the code base. So not a huge number of people, but this is the one recent example we have of an open source project doing this, so I think it's still worth looking at. So, you know, a 150% jump or a 50% jump is not really all that useful off a base that small. So if we have a look at what those new contributions were and what those new contributors were, the stuff that got accepted was very classic drive-by contribution. So little changes to the docs, few things on message strings, making them more comprehensible, making them more standard, some updates to code comments, so a lot of text stuff. There were two patches in particular which were very deep, very specific around some protocol issues, sort of five, 6-liners, but from someone who clearly had a bee in their bonnet about that particular issue of protocol. And if we look at the new contributors who sort of got involved in nginx for the first time since they moved to GitHub, they are all multi-project contributors. Going through the GitHub profiles, these are people who do drive-bys on projects quite often. And yeah, that's interesting. It's a pattern of contribution that's out there, and some of them seem to have some quite deep knowledge of certain issues. The comments that got stuck, or sorry, the pull requests that got stuck, some of them were also text issues, and then there was a whole category around standards behavior updates. You know, things like you can't call it favcon.ico anymore, you need to give it a type, various of those sorts of things, possibly a result of the fact that unlike the SQL standard, all of the stuff is public. People can go see the document and say, oh, I like that, I want to go do something about that. But again, some of it may not be practical in the wild. The software may have to move a little more slowly than the standards do. There aren't any really big chunks of code sitting there waiting to be reviewed in the nginx pull request list as of 2 days ago. So onto the question of whether the tools shape the process. There are one or two things that happened early on here which I think is just about people not being familiar with the tools. Contributors withdrawing patches, or in fact being asked to withdraw patches and reformat them, squash them, etc., and resubmit them. So the committers hadn't really got their heads around, you know, making some of those changes themselves and force pushing stuff. There was also quite a lot of comment and requests for updates around stylistic issues. Things like the punctuation of commit messages seems to be quite a big thing for them. This is stuff which in the current Postgres process, the committers would polish it as they committed. You wouldn't see that sort of interaction, and the GitHub PR flow does provide a way for that to happen. This idea of force pushing the patch branches to sort of get some changes into them, but I don't I don't think it's particularly what nginx did. I think it is just the nature of that process, that effectively you have to catch the branch up before you can now make some changes to it. Looking at the diffs from those changes that the committers make just before they merge, they're very difficult to read because they've got a whole lot of noise in them from everything that happened between the initial submission of the PR and when the committer is now cleaning it up. So not very useful content, difficult stuff to dig through for getting any information. So on to sort of what do we do with all this information? I think there is some evidence here that moving to GitHub pull requests did increase the contribution through first-time or one-off contributions to the project. It's a little too early in this exercise to see if these people now come back again every few months or get more actively involved. One question I'm left with is whether this is Git in general. Would you see the same effect on the Postgres community's own Git systems? Or is the discoverability that is provided by GitHub, the ease of access but provided by everyone already having an account there, part of what made this useful? And if that's the case, is there some sort of backflow tooling that's needed to make PR submitted on GitHub into patches to then pull into the Postgres environment? I'm not sure how practical that is in terms of just endless loops, but it's an interesting one. The flow doesn't seem to suit big incrementally accepted patches. You know, the process there would have to be creating a branch, cherry picking certain commits. I personally quite like the hand-polished patching in Postgres at the moment. The fact they've been cleaned up for readability, that the reviewability is a big deal. So I don't think there's any evidence for moving any of that. If there is a case to be made from nginx's experience for using pull requests, it is in addition to, going back to my first slide about it, not as a replacement, based on this evidence at least. There is some noise generated by the tools. I think that we'd end up quite quickly in a situation where a lot of the noise would be, please go find the history of this topic. We see that on the mailing list a bit already, but if we now show up with effectively a clean slate, some of the suggestions that people will arrive with are things that will have been discussed before, and you know there'll be quite a lot of that kind of noise. And this is a web form thing. A lot of the default displays are what's open, so a lot of that noise will stay front and center forever, unless something is done to clean it up. And that cleanup might be a sweeper bot. It might be a new category of participant. So a lot of what we see around the pull request process also looks like some of the statuses that we have in the CommitFest app. You know, this needs review. It's gone back to the author. The author now needs to do something about it. But that is not, under the Git model, something that just anyone can do. It's someone who needs privileges on the repo. So either there would have to be some automations, or there would have to be another category of participants created to do all of those tasks. Something like the CommitFest managers, but maybe a bigger group. So yeah, that is what I think there is to learn, some of the questions that it opens. Any thoughts and questions from the audience?
So in terms of cleanup, if I understand correctly, you're saying that because sort of the default view is things that are open, things might just accumulate there for a long time. Do you think that that's actually a disadvantage compared to patches submitted to a mailing list that get lost or sit there for a long time?
So I think one of the advantages with the mailing list is each of us kind of gets to define our own timeout for what we're going to go look at, rather than being told whenever we just look at the particular mailbox this thing lives in, oh, these haven't got attention. The look of just having piles and piles of open, unresponded to stuff, I don't think it would be good. I think the mailing list makes that less obvious, and in a way that is probably more socially, for a sort of a broad definition of social, accepted.
Okay, thanks.
Whenever this, I have seen whenever this conversation comes up, like can PostgreSQL move to pull requests? One of the things that is raised is the community does not want to move, like they want to see the action on the mailing list. So is there a way, I know that when we comment on PR, it can send an email to the mailing list. But let's say somebody responds on the mailing list, can that go back and get reflected on the GitHub?
I'm sure some of those automations are practical. You know, the mailing list managers track threads already. That I suppose is one of the open questions. Is for a certain category of patches, for things like the comment typos, the layout of messages. Would that still have to be as visible if we were talking about quite small stuff, these drive-bys, or would just a commit time message of okay, we've just accepted the following, just dropping that into the mailing list be good enough? Again, depending very much on the nature of the changes we're talking about here.
Well, at least right now what I hear conclusion is that mailing list has to happen. Like the conversation should be visible on mailing list, whether it's small or big, doesn't matter. The second question, the second concern that gets raised is GitHub is like the tools. I mean, community has developed most of the tools itself that it's using, and GitHub is a third-party tool. So the concern is that what if the GitHub goes away, and along with that we also lose all the conversation. That's another reason why we want it on mailing list, because it will stay in our archives.
Absolutely. You know, the thing that happened with SourceForge was not fun. We don't want to end up repeating that. Again, I think the evidence is more for doing this in addition to, as a way of capturing some of the contribution from those drive-by contributors who do just engage in quite small ways with quite a wide number of projects. There is some value in those people's contributions by the look of it.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's also this middle ground between what it sounds like nginx did and what is possible. You don't have to go necessarily straight from mailing lists to all in on GitHub. Yeah. In the previous times that these conversations have come up, has there been a discussion of maybe the Postgres community hosting their own software forge?
Well, I mean,
we have in the past, it just doesn't work. Maintaining that is a lot of work.
Yeah. Been there, burnt out doing that, yeah.
He also misses out on probably the main benefit of moving to GitHub at all, which is that's where everyone already is. Like the point is to move your community closer to the developers.
Yeah.
You do that at this point by going to GitHub. And I just wanted to say thank you for this talk. I have a small computational geometry library that maybe a half dozen contributors to, but we declared bankruptcy on our track instance and moved to GitHub a couple years ago, and we've seen the same pattern you saw, about 25 to 50% more contributions, and from the same sort of profile of people you said. Not folks who are coming in saying, I'm getting into this project full time, but folks with legitimate, narrow, usually easy to merge and review contributions, but stuff we wouldn't have done. The other really great one for us has been, we are upstream of a whole bunch of other projects, and those downstream projects now, they're also on GitHub. Very easy for them to take bugs that they discover in their app, which in fact are our fault, and bring those issues up to us.
So I was going to ask specifically on how nginx does it. When they merge, like, do they enforce squashing merges of PRs, or do they maintain the branch history in the PR on merge?
They force push them. They don't maintain the branch history. The last message in most of those PRs is that those branches have been deleted.
More questions? So, thank you for the insightful vlog. Yeah, or no questions.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone.